Hi and welcome to this webinar. Today I'm going to be looking at the TOEFL writing section, and just briefly I'll tell you what I'm going to cover during this session. So we'll be looking at the structure and the format of the writing section of the test. We'll also look at the two different writing tasks in the test and the question types that they'll find, those candidates will find in each section of the test. We're going to look at the use of paraphrasing, the importance of linking and transition words, reporting verbs, especially for reporting opinions and ideas that students listen to and read in the text and listening passages, and also the power of imagination over facts. As one thing I find with TOEFL students is some of them feel a little bit anxious when it comes to expressing their own opinions, or perhaps they don't have enough personal experience themselves. So I invite students to use their imagination and actually invent and make up content to go into those responses. And also the power of peer correction. Another thing I find with students is they may feel very uncomfortable looking at their own writing, but they find it quite easy to look at other samples of writing, and they gain a lot from the correction. To be able to correct somebody else's responses helps you to find out what you yourself do well and not so well in writing. So to get started, what I would like to look at next is the writing section, just to give you a brief overview of it. It's the fourth and final section in the test. I don't know why in testing that we tend to put writing at the very end. It's possibly the skill in language that most people enjoy the least. I'd like to see it come up front and almost get it out of the way. But anyway, in TOEFL, as with other standardized tests, writing is the last section. It lasts about an hour to complete the two tasks. One task is allotted 20 minutes, another is 30 minutes, and in the 20-minute question there will also be a 3-minute listening section approximately, and again 3 minutes is allotted to a reading section. Students are required, as I said, to complete two tasks. The first one is an integrated task, so the students will first they will first read a text. The text will be available for 3 minutes on the screen, after which it disappears, and during that time the student will have taken notes. They then listen to somebody speak about the text or in the context of the information in that text. So the listening passage generally also lasts about 3 minutes. They will also take notes, and then they will need to integrate that information into the final response. The second question is the personal experience question, or the personal opinion question. The student has no other information available to them other than a question prompt, and they have 30 minutes to plan a 300-word, 4 or 5 paragraph essay there. Just one thing to note is students do need to type via a keyboard. That keyboard may not be their own, and the reason I want to emphasize this is when I sat the TOEFL test myself, I was unhappily surprised at the age and clunkiness of the keyboard that was in front of me, and it actually did pose me a few problems and made me feel quite anxious as I was going, because I was not using a keyboard that I was used to. So if you have an opportunity, or the student has an opportunity while teaching TOEFL to use different keyboards, I know that's easier than it sounds, but it is a good opportunity for the student to understand that they will be, while it'll be a QWERTY keyboard, the keyboard may be different, and as I said, mine was certainly a lot older than I expected to see in the test itself, so it can cause some problems. So to get an initial student rolling, you've done a pre-test with them perhaps, or some kind of grammar diagnostic, and found out their strengths and weaknesses. Also, I would suggest if you take on TOEFL lessons, they should be at a high B2 level, so that you're just concentrating on the skills in the TOEFL exam rather than looking at general English vocabulary or grammar issues that the student has. So to start off, just general questions about writing, how they feel about it. Most people usually underreport their own abilities, and it's the same with students as they go into TOEFL, but get them thinking about the things that they are good at. Some of them can type well. Most students today are very comfortable using technology and different forms of hardware, but can they write a good topic sentence? Do they feel comfortable expressing their own ideas in text, not just in using the spoken word? And find out how much they write even on a daily basis in their own language. A lot of us don't write very much anymore, and if we do, they tend to be short emails, social media, very short notes, text messages, but it's rare even that us as teachers are writing large amounts of text. So that's something to keep in mind, that students may not even have done this for a while, even if they are in the school system. So find out how much they do actually write at the moment. Another thing that I like to introduce is to get them feeling that, a TOEFL scores from 1 to 5, 5 being the best response that you can give, and that means that the communication has to be clear, you have to use appropriate vocabulary, varying sentence structure, but it also means having a certain style, and that takes a while to get used to. The good thing about TOEFL, like standardized tests, it's both a good and bad thing. There is a formula to the writing because there is a rubric. The scorers are looking consistently for the same things in that writing. You're not expected to write something particularly original, but you are expected, as I mentioned at the beginning, paraphrasing, reporting verbs, linking the ideas, and showing the relationships within the text. So what I do is tend to show quite a lot of samples, good writing, and then here, bad writing. And while I won't go through this particular text, the text itself does contain a lot of high-level vocabulary, which would be great if it was used in a way that a native speaker would use it. Instead, what you find in this particular text, which I wrote, so it's not authentic, is that the style is very clunky. It has a woolly feeling to it, and this is something that students need to avoid. They may not be able to pick that, but what they will find is a lot of the vocabulary may be beyond them, or the other thing is that students may feel that they can make up for any stylistic kind of issues that they have with weaknesses that they have by throwing in a lot of vocabulary. While it's important to show a wide vocabulary, it's also important to show how that is used correctly. So you need to be very careful with students in their use of high level. You want them to steer away from any jargon or technical vocabulary, which they won't find generally in the reading or listening passages, but also making sure that they have a good sense of phrasal verbs if they are going to use them. As you know, phrasal verbs are used very commonly in spoken English, less so in writing, but they still are used, and you want to make sure that the language that they are using is really language that they should feel comfortable with, but also that we would anticipate finding in writing of this style. Another thing I introduce early on is the scoring. So this is the scoring rubric, more or less, used by TOEFL speakers. It doesn't go into a great amount of depth because we don't know exactly what they're looking for, but it is good for students to know the audience for whom they're writing. And I think as you do the writing, you should return again and again to the scoring and look at each element within the scoring. There are 3 categories down the side that relate to the development of the topic, the structural organization and clarity of the information that the student is writing about, and of course the nuts and bolts, the use of the language. So you should be coming back to that time and time again through the lessons, any writing lesson that you do, so the student is constantly, they may feel satisfied with what they've done, but when you bring up the scoring, have they really answered all of the elements that are within the rubric? Okay, another thing that I use is a template. I force my students to use a template. I also force them to learn it by heart eventually. It's simply the right thing to do when you're working within a time limit and generally under pressure to get something done. If you use a template in both the response itself, but also for taking notes, this is a formidable tool to have. Rather than, I believe that planning is important, and so it's something that students need to do right at the beginning when they're starting, and that also goes for the other aspect, the other skills. Templates are useful also, particularly in the speaking section. Now, another thing that students worry about, of course, is their time management because they're working under pressure and within the time limit. So for the second written task, where they have 30 minutes, you must enforce the plan, you must enforce the template, but get them talking about other people's views. Again, I've invented these here. They're not particular things that my students have said, but they're typical of all of us try to kind of take away any attention to our faults and highlight the other things. Some of us can write fast, but we may not write very accurately. We may not be strong spellers, but do TOEFL examiners really worry about that? And of course they do. There is some sources in the TOEFL books say that you can get away with making several spelling errors. I don't know if this is 100% correct, but I think you possibly can make one or two, provided that they're not reckless and they don't hinder the understanding of the overall text. So talk about time management and advice, even if it's made up of other students, to get them thinking about what's really important. Linking and transition words, I've just put a text here, and I often highlight transition words in sample texts and ask students to tell me the relationship. What is that linking and or transition word doing with the information that is before and after? How are the ideas linked through these transition words? And in a way, transition words are getting the speaker ready for the information that comes after. So get them very used to the transition words. We actually have a series of linking and transition word lessons on our site, Off2Class, that run through the transition words for addition, sequence, which most people are very familiar with, first, second, third, but also comparing and contrasting, and other groups of transition words that are useful when writing. Paraphrasing is something you should do constantly. So as students write samples, you can look for sentences that are not particularly well written, but also ones that have been well written, and get students to paraphrase them in another way. There is an art to paraphrasing. It takes a lot of time, and it's usually something that even native speakers do not do in their own writing. We only do it if we review something before we click send, or send the document off. So paraphrasing is a very important thing to do for reading and for really understanding if we've transmitted the meaning of what we wanted in the first place. So some of the things, there are 3 techniques that work for paraphrasing in particular, one better than the other 2. And the first one, perhaps I'll start at the bottom of this here, is the rearranging of phrases. This is the easiest one to do. So at the top, I've got an example that I've pulled from a text, and then the 3 ways of perhaps paraphrasing it. None of them work in isolation. Even if you reorder phrases in a sentence, you probably still need to change some grammatical forms, or you might like to change an adjective into a noun. So you can secondly alter the grammatical forms of words and phrases. And also, although they won't have access to a dictionary, students should think about substituting synonyms where they can. This is probably the least successful for many students in the time frame that they have, because they don't have a dictionary at their disposal, and it's simply a matter of recalling that. And if you don't have the word, you can't possibly find it because it doesn't exist in your current acquisition of the language. But paraphrasing is something to come back to again and again, not just for one lesson, but as you write. So linking words, linking and transition words, and paraphrasing in particular. Again, I also do a little bit of students' advice, particularly bad advice. Bad advice is always good because the students get to think about it and why they shouldn't be doing the things that always are recommended to us, and get them to think about why these particular things. For example, a lot of people and a lot of the other books that are out there on studying for standardized tests push vocabulary. I personally feel that depending on the time between the TOEFL lesson starting and the date of the TOEFL test, that studying vocabulary is a very poor way to use your time. Wide reading over an extended period of time is the only way to really imbibe vocabulary to a point that you can regurgitate it without thinking about it too hard later on. And all of us know this, and yet we still sometimes get a bit lazy and teach vocabulary lists or academic vocabulary, or changing things, active verbs into passive forms. All of that should be done separately, and it shouldn't really be a big part of teaching TOEFL. The student either has the vocabulary or should just be reading as much as possible on the side to increase the vocabulary, but I don't think it's something that you should do. I think it's actually poor advice for a TOEFL student. Also, planning is essential. It doesn't matter how you feel about the time limit, you must put time aside, and if the student does have a template, then planning is something that will come naturally to them, and they should be doing that brainstorming and planning, sketching out a few notes before they proceed to writing. Okay, so there's a bit more there, but I'll move on. Using prompts, and as you can see, all of these prompts have reporting verbs in them. English, like most other languages, is extremely rich in prompts, and it really is just about style rather than always writing the writer says, the speaker says. Students should use a variety. It makes for better reading, and it won't bore the audience as quickly. They don't have to learn a whole lot of them, and most of them are in the standard kind of like the writer suggests that. Some of them do take a direct object, but on the whole, there's a very standard format for structure for using reporting verbs in English. Okay, so on to the first question type, which is known as the academic reading and lecture synthesis. Basically, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's a reading activity followed by a listening activity, and then the student integrates that information into a synthesized written activity. There are 3 question types within that, which I'll go through in a moment. There's not a lot of difference between them, but recognizing the question type will help the student to think about the language that they are going to use in their written response. The topic is academic, but I don't think that the language used in the reading text and listening passages are particularly academic. They can be understood by any educated person, and the idea is they want you to be able to write about it. There's no obscure jargon or technical terms, and even in the reading activity, if there is a particularly difficult vocabulary that is related to that particular academic discipline, it will appear in the glossary, and at most there are 1 or 2 words that will appear at the bottom of the reading text. So the reading text comes up for 3 minutes. It goes away, and then the student will listen to a speaker who speaks about that particular text, and then the listening is done. You can't listen to it again, but the reading will appear while the writing activity takes place in the 20-minute time span. So first of all, just to show you, if you're going to make your own materials, this is about 300 words. It's about the maximum as well that fits neatly onto a PowerPoint. So you can get the whole thing on there, and I recommend, if you feel comfortable as a teacher writing, go ahead and write some TOEFL style writing activities. It's good practice for you, and certainly what you can also do is then you can start playing with these. So if you do go in and write them, you write something that would appear in the test, and then you can remove, for example, all the transition and linking words. You could even mix them up and then get the student to put them back in, put in new transition words, choose sentences here that can be paraphrased. So you can do all of the skill building that I mentioned previously by using your own text and simply having them as a PowerPoint. Doing the listening activities is a little harder, but students enjoy listening to their own teacher speak. So if you have a microphone and you're using from some free source audio software like Audacity, which is fantastic, you can combine those together and get some real authentic text going. Obviously, there are plenty of materials available on the internet already, but if you want to make your own, it's highly recommended. So here, after the reading activity, I bring in this kind of thing. Pretty simple. They don't need to stare at it very much. It just tells them to take notes, and I go ahead and play the listening passage for them. And once our listening passages are actually embedded with player controls into the site itself, so they're very easy to use, not too much fiddling around. And then onto the challenge question itself. So the student doesn't see the question until having listened and read the information, and then the first thing that they will appear next is the question prompt itself. So the challenge question, there are 3 different types of questions in the academic synthesis. The first is a challenge question, and these appear most commonly of the 3 question types. A challenge question is exactly what it says. The reading text will put forward certain points of view or present certain information, and when the speaker comes on, they will alert their audience immediately to the fact that they disagree with or are not in agreement with a lot of the the facts that are presented, and they'll state that more or less explicitly in the opening 30 seconds, minute of the listening activity. So the reason I say they're challenge questions is what the student does. These writing tasks are all about showing the relationships between the ideas. So if the relationship is one of challenging or disagreement, then what the student really needs to be using is not conflict. They want to be showing contrast, and in order to show contrast, we have lots of linking words in English. So here's a question. I write down the plan, the template for the plan, which the student needs to learn off or by heart. And then I would get them to also be using transition and linking words to show contrast. So words like although, even though, however, nevertheless, nonetheless, in contrast to, there are a whole bunch of them, but knowing that it's a challenge question helps them think about the language that they are going to use. A lesser known or a lesser used question that will appear on the test is the opposite of the challenge question. It's a support question. So what the speaker will do is agree with the statements made in the reading text and then add additional information, and these are usually examples. So again, because you need to show the relationship, what you'll be wanting to use here, are linking words that show addition, and there are many of them in English. So additionally, furthermore, I won't go through all of them on the slide, but again, so challenge questions will require linking words to show contrast, while these particular questions, the support question, will require linking words showing addition. The final one in the series is a problem and solution question. So get students talking about problems, and the reason I've shown this particular screen to you is TOEFL, like many of the other standard tests today, are often dealing with environmental issues, probably because that's something that is affecting us more and more in the current environment. So although I said before, don't teach specific vocabulary, you should encourage students learning or planning to take TOEFL to think about, if you're doing other writing, reading, listening lessons, really highlight and emphasize the importance of environmental issues, as they do appear quite often in the TOEFL exam, and not just in this particular question type. So get students talking about problems, because for every problem there should be a solution. You can do role-playing things for this, where you state a problem and get them to kind of think about recommendations, solutions, suggestions, the language that would actually be used by somebody who needs to offer a solution. So as I said before, they'll need to summarize the issues and then understand the solutions that will be provided by the lecture. So the reading text will present perhaps an environmental problem about water pollution by factories, water pollution by households, and water pollution by maybe other commercial industry, and then the speaker will provide particular solutions that could be implemented, whether it's filters of some sort or moving factories to a different place, something along those lines, but it always supports the text. And I failed to mention previously that the really good thing about the integrated question task in TOEFL is that the order in which the issues are presented in the reading will be mirrored by the speaker. So the main key points, there will be 3 key points in each reading text. These will be mirrored and dealt with in the same order by the speaker. So that's nice and easy. The template shows you can have them side by side. Once they've got written down the points, their notes for the reading activity, the 3 key points, the speaker will address that first key point, not the third one, and then go back. So it's always in the same order, nice and easy to understand. And here I'm showing a couple of example problem and solution questions. You can see that the words problems or issues, solutions actually appear in the question itself. But again, the speaker in the lecture will show through language that he or she is about to talk about solutions. Again, I would always be returning to scoring a sample response. So you should put up your own, if you can't use student sample responses, put up your own sample responses that are as authentic as possible and get the student to start thinking about it. There's nothing wrong with using model paragraphs as well. I don't think that TOEFL examiners are looking for a huge amount of originality. They are looking for the ability to communicate particular skills and ideas and the information that has been presented to them. So there's nothing wrong with using, especially the linking and transitioning words, as I said, but the prompts that I mentioned before with reporting verbs. And another thing that I will highlight is the students must never give their opinion when they have not been asked for it. So in task 1, this is not about their personal experience. This is reporting the information from the listening and the reading text. And one mistake that some students do is just throw in their opinion at the end or even in the introduction. That is not what they should be doing. So make sure that they are reporting on the professor and the author's points of view. Okay, the second task is possibly the least enjoyable thing on the test for a lot of people. I don't really enjoy writing personal opinion essays myself, so maybe that's me projecting my thoughts, but it's the independent task. This is the 30-minute essay. There is no other information other than a prompt that will appear with the question, and the student must answer from their personal experience and knowledge. So obviously, if you don't have that particular knowledge or feel that you don't have that particular knowledge or don't feel confident expressing your own opinions, what I tend to do with those students there is, again, as I mentioned, the power of information. Find out how good they are at just making stuff up. It really does work for them. So here in the second task, again, there are 3 subtypes. They will either be asked to agree or disagree with the statement. The question will ask the student to choose a preference between 2 choices. So they will say literally, what do you prefer? Or you will be asked to write about multiple things, multiple causes, effects, or qualities. The reason I put those words in italics is that they generally appear as a plural noun, which is an indicator that it is that third, the multiple opinion question type. They have 30 minutes to complete the task. Go for a 4 or 5 paragraph essay. The multiple opinion question, which I will address later, I recommend that they only do a 4 paragraph essay for that one. And the student should attempt to write 300 words or more, which goes back to the idea of make sure they feel comfortable typing on multiple keyboards, especially if students in their non-native language are using perhaps a French or a Turkish keyboard. Keys are in different places, so be aware of that. Okay, again, I don't want to harp on this too much, but students can sometimes feel very anxious about writing personal experiences, so I tend to put in something here about just invent stuff. No one is going to check the accuracy, the truthfulness, or the veracity of what you say. Then again, don't say anything outlandish, but you can put in things that can't be checked that make it seem like you're talking about a personal experience, and that is fine. So I sometimes put in questions. My own sample questions are things that are a little more controversial, and well, there's nothing controversial in TOEFL because the personal experience questions are always about family, community, and maybe extend to country, but they never deal with politics or religion. I use sample questions to get people talking because they are more likely to talk, or if they feel emotional about something, they are more vested in it. So you can consider doing that. Obviously, you need to consider the sensitivities, the cultural sensitivities of your students. Don't get into anything offensive, but provoke is not the word, but you want to start getting them to, you want to encourage them to start talking about things, and they can do it generally. A role play that you can do to get people talking or to defend things that are difficult is obviously you set up the courtroom between you and the student, and you can debate different things. And if you have a large number of students, that's a very good way of getting people to actually defend things that they don't necessarily believe, or that they even feel that they have the experience to be commenting on and talking about. So the 3 types. in task 2 in the personal experience questions. The first is a preference question. They must choose one opinion of the two presented. So there are some example ones here. If we look at the second one, so do you disagree or agree with the statement, it is beneficial to exercise regularly? You must choose one. You cannot they're not looking for a balanced argument of the two varying things here. You must give one. You must agree with one and disagree or agree and run with that. So before they need to choose that, unless they feel super comfortable, another thing I enforce with the preference questions in TOEFL lessons is that I get them to write down the list in columns of for and against, if you like, but they only pick one side to write about, and make sure that they squiggle out the other stuff before they start writing their sample, because this can be a little bit confusing when I'll show you the last question type in this series. So that's for preference questions. I tend to also do sample questions where I just pull out particular body paragraphs, and I often put in spelling mistakes, stylistic errors, as I mentioned before, or stylistic errors, but things that are written in a bad or complicated or confusing style, and also get them to think about what could be invented in the text but doesn't actually detract from the text itself. How can you verify any of this stuff? How can the scorer be verifying any of this stuff and they're not looking to do it? So I continue to emphasize that with certain students. The multiple opinion questions is another question type. So this requires you to provide two opinions or points of views, and as I said, the giveaway in the question prompt will be a noun in the plural: factors, effects, ways, cause, reasons, qualities, etc. Okay, so you don't choose a point of view. You're not choosing a preference. The view, if you like, will be given to you, and you have to give several opinions about it. Okay, so for example, here I've given some examples. So what are the advantages? They're not saying the advantages or the disadvantages, or do you think it has advantages or disadvantages? What are the advantages? They're stating the fact here, and then you need to support your opinion with reasons and examples. This one is the one that's the most difficult to do because it gives you a narrower choice. Not that students would violently disagree and say that there are only disadvantages of a public transport system. They should be able to find both, but again, they are only going to be writing on the advantages. So they need to be very aware of that it is different. The opinion is chosen for them, and they have to follow that one there as well. So I often give sample notes as well. If students are really struggling, give them some notes, and that helps students to think about, that's a good idea, and why didn't they think about this? And that will extend. You can only talk about a limited number. I suggest 3 ideas and 3 reasons for the body paragraphs. However, during the note-taking exercise, students should be brainstorming as many ideas as possible, and then simply deleting the ones that are the weakest ones, or keeping the strongest ones to actually write their piece on. Okay. Finally are the pros and cons questions. These have a different name as well. For and against, I can't remember, some other books call them different things, but it's pretty easy. Here you have to do contrasting opinions, and they may ask you for your preference on top of that. So these questions will have language like compare and contrast, advantages, disadvantages, likes and dislikes. So already you can see that you're going to be looking at, as I say, two sides of the coin, and that you must present the balanced argument, and perhaps if you're asked, to express your preference at the end. Here are some example pros and cons questions. So again, what do you like and dislike about supermarkets, and why? Now in the question underneath, you can see the question asks the student to compare advantages and disadvantages, but also asks, which do you prefer? The reason I put these 2 questions on is that some teachers don't feel that a conclusion is required in TOEFL. I always get my students to write a conclusion, no matter how short. It doesn't have to be long and too enlightening. But in the second question, a conclusion is requested. So in the first opening paragraph, the student should give the advantages, disadvantages, and can state what they prefer. And in the conclusion, they can explain after giving their body paragraphs why, in fact, they prefer it. So be aware of that. And just lastly, again, more body paragraphs here. This one's already got plenty of mistakes you'll be able to see just from reading a couple of sentences. So again, they'll be wanting to use lots of linking and transition words linking and transition words for contrasting. So even though, however, nonetheless, again, are very important in the pros and cons questions. Okay, so tips for teaching. When I teach, I tend to stick to the time limits. But I'm going to go back on what I just said then. When I'm teaching, I stick to the time limits with reading, I stick to the time limit with writing. When it comes to doing the 20 or the 30-minute exercise, the reality is if you're teaching that, as a teacher, you're a little bit under pressure. What do I do when a student is doing a 20-minute writing activity? If your student does feel comfortable while you look over his or her shoulder, go for it. There's nothing wrong with stopping them, not mid-sentence, but as you're coming to the end of an introductory paragraph, you can stop there, you can look at that. What could you improve? How are you going to start your next body paragraph that links with the linking and transition word to the previous paragraph? Make sure that they have a topic sentence to start with. And as you progress and become more comfortable with them writing, and they become more comfortable writing, maybe you won't stop them for 5 or 6 minutes until they've written both the introduction and the first body paragraph. But I tend to break that up quite a lot as I'm starting off with TOEFL students until they become more and more comfortable and faster at writing. As I've mentioned before, I don't focus on vocabulary and grammar. I will point it out. It's worth correcting. Don't do the correction, just circle the words that are wrong, and the grammar as well. If there are grammars are particularly difficult it can be challenging to teach when a student's learning the skills and structure of the test, format of the test, to go back and say, hey, we need to go back and do a lesson on present perfect. But if you need it, if the student's doing that, take the time to actually go back, not during the lesson, but to go back and do that at a separate time and look at it outside TOEFL lessons themselves. I've made a mistake in the next one, so I would emphasize linking and transition words. I probably emphasized that enough. The scorers are looking for these. Ensure that your student is using them. I tend to overuse them in my samples because I think when I write naturally, I don't use that many at all anymore, but the scorers are looking for them, so make sure your student is using them. Again, enforce reporting verbs. Don't allow your student simply to say that the writer said, the speaker noted. You want them to be using a few, and even as you go through, as I said, you're breaking up these tasks. You can go back and ask them, rewrite this one, paraphrase this one, use another reporting verb, or what other reporting verb could you use? Scoring and correction. Students should score their own work. They should score and correct other samples of writing. I believe that just like homework correction, this is a very valuable task for students to learn about their own writing skills. And then if you're going to be a good TOEFL teacher, if you've got the time to go and sit the TOEFL test, it is a very valuable experience. There were things about it I really liked. It's very simple. It looked like we were using Microsoft 95. It's a very, very basic system, but it works extremely well. But there were two things I didn't like. One I mentioned before was the keyboard, and the second one, the supposed noise cancelling earphones that I had. They were great earphones, but you've actually got people in the speaking section, moving at a different pace. And so while you're trying to talk, you're trying to block out the speech of the people behind you, and that can be really distracting. So although you can't perhaps recreate a true TOEFL test environment in your classroom, be aware that the keyboard is an important thing to think about, the headphones in the speaking section, and be prepared to make your own resources. I think that's a really good way of getting into the feel of what a student actually needs to do, and it's a good task for teachers to make their own resources. However, of course, if you don't want to do that, you are more than welcome to come over onto Off2Class and use ours. And thank you for joining us today. Next week we will be looking at the reading section of the TOEFL test. Thanks for joining.